So Helldivers 2 is a month old now, and it's still very much fun to play. And while online discourse for the game has, for the most part, been very positive, certain aspects of the game balance have seen heated discussion online. As someone who's really interested in exploring the ways people approach games, this was a topic I found myself really interested in. To lay some groundwork, Helldivers 2 is a cooperative shooter where you drop onto planets under attack by various factions and complete set objectives within a time limit. One of the main appeals is how hectic and over the top the combat is. The game also features an array of different types of air support, which just help add to the chaos. It also has a unified campaign board where the entire player base works towards the same objectives, meaning that where and what you're fighting for changes constantly. I'm not going to give you the full rundown of the game. If you haven't played it yet, you should heavily consider giving it a go. We're here to talk about game balance. So what's the problem people have with Helldivers 2? Well, it's to do with the loadout weapons. Loadout weapons are the ones you drop with on a mission, so your primary and secondary. The issue people have is that the vast majority of them seem to be kind of weak, through some combination of not dealing enough damage, not killing enemies quickly enough, or having low ammo capacity. This isn't a huge deal early on, when the difficulty is low and armoured enemies are rare or even non-existent, but as you progress and want to try harder and harder difficulties, the game introduces not only more enemies to fight, but tougher ones too, which means that your typical weapon loadout is going to get very quickly overwhelmed by what is thrown at you. Let's take a look at the Liberator as an example. It's the first primary you get and is supposed to act as the game's jack of all trades, but it takes a whole lot of work to kill anything but the most basic enemies. Oftentimes even medium-sized enemies take 1 or 2 whole magazines to kill, which in a lot of cases can turn your engagement into a COD Zombies reenactment, where you run around in circles slowly whittling down enemies, which is pretty frustrating, particularly if more and more enemies keep showing up. It doesn't help either that you only have 7 reloads available, meaning that within 1 or 2 engagements, you are just fresh out of ammo until you can find more. This is in quite stark contrast to most typical cooperative shooters, where your loadout weapons tend to do the bulk of the work. The weapons in Helldivers 2 are good for around a third of enemies, and quickly drop in effectiveness as the enemies get larger, sometimes becoming completely ineffective. This has caused the formation of a hard meta, where certain weapons are used almost out of necessity for the difficulty, rather than personal preference. This hard meta is most clearly seen in the Breaker, a full auto, mag-fed shotgun that, at the time, was clearly the strongest primary weapon, by quite a long shot too. Here you can see it mincing through enemies that other weapons would take a much longer time handling. It makes it hard not to choose it over something else. This is, of course, an issue of player expression. If players feel like only one weapon actually does the job effectively enough, then they won't use anything else. And at worst, there comes an expectation to be running that weapon or be accused of throwing the mission. So clearly in a case like this, the weapon needs to be balanced against. But this leads to the heart of the discussion around the game's balance, and the defining divide between the developers of the game, Arrowhead, and portions of the community. Should the other weapons be buffed to make them better, or should the Breaker be nerfed to make them all the same? To get a feel for the developers' thoughts on this balance, there's no better place to look than to the game's CEO and game director, Johan Pilestedt. I believe I said that right. He's been very active on Twitter since the game took off, and has a ton of insight into their stance on game balance. It's very clear here that their focus is much more on providing new things to enjoy, over focusing on how things compare to one another. You can see him here talking about the Breaker before its recent nerf. We can infer that there's a clear line that the developers are going for in terms of loadout power, and that the Breaker actually crossed it. Arrowhead also released a community post a few days ago discussing their philosophy regarding loadout balancing, where they spell out very clearly that loadout weapons are to play a very small role in the grand scheme of things. This doesn't mean that your primary weapon should feel good to use, but please understand that it is primary only in the sense that it's something you always spawn with. It's pretty clear just from playing the game that these stratagems are supposed to be the stars of the show. Considering that a squad of 4 gets 4 each, for 16 in total, you could be calling something down every 15 seconds, which is a lot of air support. That doesn't even include things like support weapon stratagems that are miles more powerful than your loadout weapons. Now, even with this clear statement from Arrowhead on their intentions with the game design, the debate is still ongoing. In fact, in some ways it has continued to worsen as time has gone on, at one point causing something of a PR incident as devs and players butted heads on Reddit and Discord, which is to say that there's clearly still some form of issue here. Personally, I feel like a lot of the weapons dipped into frustrating territory when it came to dealing with even reasonable amounts of enemies, particularly in cases where enemies had super specific weak spots that were hard to aim at. I think a lot of it comes down to just armor penetration, as you're not really rewarded for consistently hitting shots at a distance. I think if we were to narrow things down to the true issue, is that there's a lot of mid-size enemies that are too strong to reliably deal with using loadout weapons, but are too numerous to use stratagems to deal with. Which means that oftentimes you're pigeonholed into certain setups over actually getting to experiment. Funnily enough, there is an in-universe explanation for why your loadout weapons aren't that good. Although propaganda touts Helldivers as elite troopers, they're not really expected to survive their missions. The game is designed for you to die, often. Your purpose on the ground is mostly to do the things that ships in orbit cannot, like collect things or press buttons. The game gives a full squad 20 lives, and at no point does losing them affect the mission completion. You could die 20 times in a 40-minute mission and still get a perfect score, which clearly makes a statement about your value as a trooper on the ground.
Go now, and shoot you all. Remember that.
This is in stark contrast to other games in the genre, where dying is to be avoided at all costs. So really the question is more, does Helldivers 2 sell that you're a faceless nobody well enough? And I think the answer to that is not really. I think intent is all well and good, but if something is frustrating to play, then there's definite steps that can be taken to alleviate issues. I think it's not really conveyed well enough that your primary and secondary are last resort weapons, and that for a lot of players that rug is pulled out from under them as they enter harder difficulties, rather than ingrained into them early on. We're obviously talking about quite a small facet of an otherwise fantastic game, and it's definitely not worth harassing the devs over. The game is only a month old at this point, and has already added more new content than some live service games see in a year. It'll be interesting to see where they go with things as the year goes on, and hopefully this topic doesn't become a defining feature of the community. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about the weapon balance? Let me know in the comments.